So it was VE Day. Got it completely wrong. So it was Victory in Europe Day last Friday, and I think this has been something that I've wanted to talk about. In fact, we've touched on it a couple of times on this channel before about how we as as Britain like to glorify our past to an almost unrealistic extent. For example, VE Day was a perfect example. If you looked all over Facebook and certain groups, you'd think that Britain was the only country fighting in World War II. Now, that obviously didn't happen. We were part of a group called the Allies. And what's even worse is that you see people denigrating countries that fought, like the USSR. The USSR fought in World War II and played a key role in the war. There, you cannot deny that. To deny that is to deny the history. And you can have complaints about the USSR and all that, but you can't downplay the role and the key role they played. It's exactly the same with, because at the time we were an empire and we had colonial troops. Canada played a key role in providing troops for Britain, as did India, as did Australia, New Zealand, India we mentioned before, South Africa as well. All these countries provided troops, and yet for some reason they're not mentioned. That no one seems to care that it wasn't just the UK, it was a whole group of countries that fought against fascism and the Nazis at that time. And that's a very, very dangerous path. Because I came across this article in The Scotsman, and I completely agree with the point this person was making. So, victory over Europe, how VE Day has been subverted by false patriots. 75 years is a lifetime. It's not a long one by the 21st century Western standards, but well beyond the biblical 70. Those who can remember the 8th of May 1945 are now all octogenarians, or almost so. And those who were old enough to join the late night street parties and celebrations that marked the day of Allied victory in Europe are now, like the Queen, who famously took to the streets to celebrate with her sister Margaret, are well over 90. Yet, the joyful impact of that event, marking the end of a conflict that had taken more than 70 million lives worldwide, had once seemed likely to end in victory for Adolf Hitler's horrifying brand of fascism. It remains so engraved in British public memory that there are many who were not there at that time, but still cling to it passionately as a symbol of a mighty victory of good over evil. My parents, who were in their early 20s on VE Day, remember it as a moment of huge relief and happiness, but also of some anxiety about what the future might hold after the huge disruptions of the war years. For them, the real joy came with the thunderous Labour victory in the general election 2 months later, which gave them real hope about a better future for which they had been fighting. Yet for many of the next generation who were not there, who grew up in the golden glow of Britain's post-war self-congratulation celebrated in a myriad of post-war films and comic stories, the idea of VE Day has become nothing more complex than a celebration of British greatness and a chance to reaffirm the sense of Britain as a special and virtuous country and a blessed plot compared to the more blighted lands of continental Europe. All of which goes a surprisingly long way towards explaining the painful situation in which the United Kingdom finds itself on this 75th anniversary of victory in Europe. As Dr. Johnson once observed, patriotism is often the last refuge of scoundrels, and for the last 40 years since Britain took its first steps away from that post-war legacy, Some of the most scoundrel forces in UK politics have been using the language of patriotism, of the Second World War nostalgia, and of unthinking British exceptionalism to obscure their profound and mounting betrayal of the future for which the majority of the wartime generation hoped. A betrayal cruelly emphasised this week as the UK's COVID death toll became the highest in Europe, passing the 30,000 mark in government numbers and more than 50,000 according to a Financial Times estimate. So here, for those tempted by the British government's VE Day narrative of British victory over the virus, is a reminder of the three key ways in which this pseudo-patriotic government and its allies have betrayed the true meaning of Britain's victory in Europe 75 years ago. In the first place, they belittle the meaning of this event by describing it as Britain's victory. Indeed, in one Daily Mail souvenir offer this week, was briefly described as Britain's victory over Europe, when in fact it was the victory of the Allies in Europe and the end of the conflict which finally united most of the world in the struggle against fascism. In second place, they regularly weaken and betray the post-war legacy of the international institution building to prevent a return of fascism and economic instability that tends to cause it. By threatening that institutional framework with the ill-deserved and disrespect hostility, it is in the US and the main target of the new rights hostility in the United Nations and the UN agencies like the WHO, currently one of Donald Trump's favourite scapegoats. In the UK, though, it has been the European Union, subjected to a 20-year campaign of vilification in some sections of the British press, and now still contending with a British government doggedly determined to end our current economic, legal and trading relationship with the EU at midnight on the 31st of December, come what may. Of course, Brexit Britain's disaster has far more to do with the extreme forms of global deregulation for the wealthy than with any form of patriotism. But the continued culture of post-war British exceptionalism among older voters made this dodgy and damaging scheme a tragically easy sell, at least in some quarters. And then, finally, there is the fact that the patriots behind this right-wing triumph in British politics, while probably well-meaning as individuals and generally convinced that they love their country, have never dealt in the detail of their policies, made the choices that would demonstrate a primary concern of the well-being of the ordinary people of Britain. On the contrary, just as they embraced Thatcherism in the 1980s, showed a brutal disregard for communities across the UK blown apart by the loss of the heavy industries around which they had been built, so their willing and apparently light-hearted support of extreme austerity in the years after the 2008-09 financial crash inflicted huge damage on wages and working conditions, physical and mental health, and cuts to essential public services across the UK's most vulnerable communities. A vulnerability and lack of resilience that has now brutally been exposed by the COVID crisis. And finally, faced with that crisis, they toyed with 3 precious weeks with the idea of herd immunity, popular among some of their right-wing associates that insisted that instead of locking down early, resorting to our testing and tracing capacity to German levels, and saving tens of thousands of British lives. So today, be assured that I will be waving no flags at what should be a time of profound national shock and mourning. I will be remembering those who fought and died in the Second World War in my own moment of respect, and I will be honouring their memory by redoubling whatever efforts I can make to remove the current British government and their ilk, and out of the office for good, and to build politics here in Scotland and these islands across Europe that truly reflects the values of decent democracy, compassion, mutual respect and enlightened internationalism, and that once briefly seemed to have triumphed in that early summer of 1945. I completely agree with that. Nothing to add. Like I say, we've covered this very briefly before we've touched on this multiple times. Well, not we've touched on this channel multiple times. Again, Go back to the very first video I ever did about how Brexit Britain wants to what was the title of the video now? Wants to embrace Empire 2.0. Look at the comments of people saying no, that's never going to happen. But look at what I was saying in that video. The ideas that were that British exceptionalism, the idea that we should just be obeyed because we are British. How dare these Europeans dictate terms to us? You know, it's damaging. This whole idea of British exceptionalism, it needs to go, because it's damaging us as a country, as a nation.